Can I ask you something heavy?
How heavy?
Very heavy.
Go ahead.
Do you think human beings will ever stop going to war?
That is a big question for a Tuesday morning.
It is, but it is also one of the most important questions anyone can ask, because war is not just history. It is not just something that happened in the past, in other places, to other people. War has shaped everything: the borders on every map, the languages we speak, the values we hold, the world we live in today.
And understanding war, understanding why it happens, what it does to people, what it leaves behind, is one of the most important things we can do as human beings and as English learners.
Welcome to TalkFluent, the podcast where we learn real English through real conversations. I am Nora.
And I am Kamal. Today we are talking about one of the oldest, most painful, and most consequential topics in human history: war. Its causes, its impact, the lessons it has left behind, and the language we use in English to talk about it.
This episode is for intermediate and upper intermediate learners, B1 and B2. The topic is serious, the language is rich, and the conversation is one we think matters deeply, not just for your English, but for how you understand the world.
Let us begin.
Let us start with something that might seem simple, but is actually quite complex. Why do wars start?
Historians have been trying to answer that question for centuries, and the honest answer is there is never just one reason. Wars almost always have multiple causes, and they are almost always connected: political, economic, cultural, historical.
But if we look across history, there are certain patterns, certain things that appear again and again in the causes of war. And understanding those patterns helps us understand history and the present.
The first one, and perhaps the most common, is the desire for territory, land, resources. Throughout history, countries and empires have gone to war to expand, to take what someone else has: oil, water, fertile land, access to the sea.
The Roman Empire expanded through centuries of military conquest. The Mongol Empire, one of the largest in history, was built almost entirely through war. European colonialism, which reshaped entire continents, was driven largely by the desire for resources and territory.
Territory, resources, these words appear in almost every major conflict in history, and they still appear today.
The second cause, nationalism, the belief that a particular group of people, defined by language, culture, ethnicity, or religion, deserves their own state, their own power, their own identity.
Nationalism is one of the most powerful forces in human history. It has started wars and it has ended empires. World War I, which killed around 17 million people, was triggered in part by a single assassination. But underneath it, for years, there had been rising nationalism across Europe. Empires were fracturing. People wanted self-determination. The assassination was the spark, but nationalism had been building the fire for decades.
Self-determination. That is a beautiful and important phrase. It means the right of a people to decide their own future, their own government, their own identity. It is one of the central ideas of modern political history.
The third cause, ideology. Wars fought not just over land or resources, but over ideas, over systems of belief about how society should be organized.
World War II is the most powerful example of this in modern history. On one side, fascism, the belief in authoritarian rule, racial hierarchy, and nationalist expansion. On the other, democracy and communism united against a common enemy. 70 to 85 million people died. Cities were destroyed. Entire peoples were targeted for extermination. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others, stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history.
The Holocaust. We have to say that word. We have to acknowledge it because one of the most important lessons of history is look at what human beings are capable of when hatred is organized and given power, and never look away.
Never look away. That phrase carries so much weight. It means face it, even when it's painful, even when it's uncomfortable, because looking away is how it happens again.
Let us talk about the impact of war, because the damage does not end when the fighting stops. Wars leave behind layers of consequences that can last for generations.
The most immediate impact: human loss, casualties, deaths. In World War I, the Battle of the Somme alone killed or wounded over 1 million soldiers in just a few months. One battle, 1 million people.
And civilians, ordinary people who were not soldiers, not combatants, just people living their life who find themselves in the middle of something they didn't choose and cannot control, have always suffered in war. In modern conflicts, civilian casualties have increased dramatically because war no longer happens only on battlefields. It happens in cities, in hospitals, in schools, in homes.
Civilian. That word means someone who is not a soldier, not a combatant, just a person living their life who finds themselves in the middle of something they didn't choose and cannot control.
The second impact, displacement. When people are forced to leave their homes because of war, they become refugees. People who have lost everything, their home, their community, their sense of safety, who must rebuild their lives somewhere else, often somewhere that doesn't fully welcome them.
Refugee. That word comes from the French word réfugié, which means someone who seeks refuge, safety, shelter. It is one of the most important words of the 20th and 21st centuries because every major war produces them, millions of human beings in search of a place that is simply safe.
The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, created one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. Over 5 million Syrians fled the country. Millions more were displaced internally. Families separated, communities destroyed, entire cities reduced to rubble.
Rubble. That word means the broken pieces of destroyed buildings. When you see photographs of a city after heavy bombardment, the buildings in pieces, the streets covered in dust and debris, that's rubble. And it's one of the most haunting images of what war does to human civilization.
The third impact, economic devastation. War is extraordinarily expensive. Weapons, armies, logistics, and then reconstruction. After World War II, Europe had to rebuild itself almost entirely. The Marshall Plan, an American program to help rebuild Western Europe, invested billions of dollars in reconstruction.
But the economic damage of war is not just physical, it's generational. When a country is at war, schools close, businesses fail, educated people leave, infrastructure collapses, and the effects of that, the lost education, the broken institutions, the interrupted development, can last for 50 years or more.
Lost generation. That's a phrase that comes from World War I. It described the young men who went to war and either died or came back so deeply changed that they couldn't fit back into ordinary life. A generation lost to violence, to trauma, to the impossibility of forgetting what they had seen.
Trauma. That word is central to any honest conversation about war. Trauma is a deep psychological wound, something that changes how a person sees the world, how they sleep, how they love, how they function, long after the danger has passed.
Soldiers returning from war often carry trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is a condition where a person continues to re-experience the terror of what they lived through. Flashbacks, nightmares, constant anxiety. The body and mind stuck in a moment of danger that has technically already ended.
And civilians carry trauma too. Children who grew up in war zones, people who lost everything, people who survived things they cannot talk about. War does not just kill bodies, it wounds minds. And those wounds, without proper care and support, can pass from generation to generation.
Let us talk about some of the most significant conflicts in modern history and what they taught the world.
World War II, which ended in 1945, changed everything. It led directly to the creation of the United Nations, an organization designed to provide a space for countries to resolve conflicts through diplomacy rather than violence. It led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document that established for the first time that every human being has rights that cannot be taken away.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, written in 1948, 30 articles. The idea that dignity, freedom, and equality belong to every person simply by virtue of being human, regardless of nationality, race, religion, gender, or any other difference.
That document was born directly from the horror of World War II, from the question the world asked after the Holocaust: how did we let this happen, and what do we need to build to make sure it never happens again?
The answer: international institutions, human rights law, the idea of war crimes and accountability. The Nuremberg trials, held after World War II, were the first time in history that leaders of a defeated nation were held criminally responsible for their actions during war. It established a principle that still matters today, that no one, not even heads of state, is above the law when it comes to crimes against humanity.
Crimes against humanity. That phrase means acts of extreme cruelty committed against a civilian population on a massive scale. Genocide, torture, forced disappearances. The idea that some acts are so terrible they are crimes not just against the people who suffered them, but against all of humanity.
And yet, despite all of this, despite the institutions built after World War II, despite the declarations and the laws and the tribunals, war did not stop. Korea, Vietnam, the Falklands, Bosnia, Rwanda, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Gaza.
The list goes on. And that is one of the most sobering things about studying war in history, not just what happened, but that it kept happening again and again, despite everything that was built to prevent it.
Rwanda, 1994. In 100 days, approximately 800,000 people were killed, most of them members of the Tutsi ethnic group, killed by their neighbors, people they had lived beside for years. The international community watched and largely did nothing.
That word, genocide, comes from the Greek word genos, meaning people or race, and the Latin caedere, meaning to kill. It means the deliberate destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. It is considered the most serious crime under international law.
And the lesson of Rwanda, the painful, devastating lesson, is that the international community failed. And that failure has shaped how the world thinks about intervention, responsibility, and the duty to protect civilians ever since.
Let us talk about something that is often not discussed enough when we talk about war: the ordinary people. Not the leaders, not the politicians, not the generals, the people who live through it.
Because that is ultimately what war is, a human experience lived by individuals, by families, by communities, by children who did not choose it, by mothers who lost sons, by men who came home and could not sleep, by cities that were rebuilt and the people who rebuilt them.
There is a phrase: war is not an adventure, it is a disease. It is like typhus. That line comes from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the French writer who also wrote The Little Prince. He lived through World War II, and he understood, from the inside, that war is not heroic, it is not glorious, it is suffering on a massive scale.
And yet, within war, there is also extraordinary human courage. People who risked everything to protect others. The people who hid Jewish families during the Holocaust at risk of their own lives. The doctors and nurses who worked in field hospitals under bombardment. The journalists who went into conflict zones to bear witness, to make sure the world could not look away.
Bear witness. That phrase means to see something and to report it, to be a witness, to say, this happened, I saw it, the world needs to know. Journalists and photographers in conflict zones are bearing witness. Writers who document atrocities are bearing witness. And in some ways, every person who reads history honestly is bearing witness too.
There's a quote, I think it was George Santayana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It's one of the most quoted lines about history, and it's quoted so often precisely because it is so true and so hard to actually do.
Because remembering the past requires something uncomfortable. It requires sitting with difficult truths, with failures, with moments when ordinary people did terrible things or allowed terrible things to happen, and not flinching.
Not flinching, staying present with the discomfort, not looking for easy answers or simple villains, because history is rarely simple, and understanding it requires complexity, nuance, honesty.
Before we close, I want to come back to the question I asked at the beginning. Do you think human beings will ever stop going to war?
Honestly, I don't know, and I think anyone who gives you a certain answer, either way, is probably not being fully honest with themselves.
What I believe, and what history seems to suggest, is that war becomes less likely when certain things are present: strong institutions, international cooperation, economic interdependence, meaning countries that trade with each other and depend on each other economically have more reasons to stay at peace. Education, the free flow of information, and accountability for leaders who choose violence.
And something harder to measure, but perhaps more important than all of those: empathy. The ability to see the person on the other side of the border, of the argument, of the political divide, as a full human being, with a family, with fears, with a life they are trying to live.
Empathy doesn't end all conflict, but the absence of empathy, the ability to see another group of people as less than human, is almost always present in the worst atrocities history has produced.
Dehumanization. That's the word. When you stop seeing people as people, when a government or a media or a movement begins to use language that describes a group of human beings as animals, as insects, as a disease, that's always the warning sign. That's always what comes before the worst.
So perhaps one of the most important things any of us can do in our own lives, in our own communities, is to resist that, to insist on the humanity of people different from us, to keep the language human, to keep the conversation open.
That's not naive. That's not weakness. It's actually one of the hardest and most courageous things a person can choose to do in a world that sometimes makes it very easy to hate.
Thank you for spending 20 minutes with us on one of the most important topics any human being can think about. This was not an easy conversation, but we believe it was a necessary one.
If today's episode helped your English and your thinking, share it with someone who is ready for a serious conversation, because the world needs more of those.
Write a comment below. Tell us, what do you think is the most important lesson history has taught us about war? We want to read your thoughts, every one of them.
I'm Kamal.
I'm Nora. Stay curious, stay human, and we'll see you in the next one.